So we're going to begin our study of a very challenging chapter in patristic theology. I feel as though I keep saying that. Perhaps every chapter is challenging, and perhaps also none more so than Dionysius the Areopagite. I think Origen is right up there in terms of how challenging it is to understand Origen and to place him within the Orthodox patristic tradition. But Origen is not, in fact, a father of the Church. Dionysius the Areopagite is. So let me begin with some introductory remarks about Dionysius, and then I'll say some more about his work and the question of the authorship of the Dionysian corpus. And then I propose to read together with you a very short treatise known as the Mystical Theology. The Mystical Theology of Dionysius, and from there sort of use that as an anchor or a focal point from which to refer to his other works, his other treatises, and indeed his other letters. The first part of the introduction will be a theological introduction. The second part will be more, who is Dionysius and what are the questions around the authorship of the corpus, and how do we place his works? And there's going to be a lot of crossover in doing this. And I think that I should begin by saying that there are two very different Dionysiuses. There is the Dionysius that was accepted by the West, which comes down to us basically through John Scotus Erigena, and there is the Dionysius who comes down to us in the East through Maximus the Confessor and Gregory Palamas, to name but a few. So, Dionysius the Areopagite can be regarded as a philosophizing theologian, or he can be regarded, as he is in the East, as an empirical theologian, one whose work is based on the prayer and liturgical life of the Orthodox Church. That, of course, is the tradition that we have received. So I want to begin, as I said earlier, by talking about the key themes in Dionysius, by way of introduction, the themes of theurgy and hierarchy, theurgia and hierarchia. So, theurgy, which comes from the word theos, God or divine, and archi, which means the beginning or principle or source of a thing. And then you have hierarchy, which comes from the Greek word hierarchia, as I mentioned, and that comes from hieros. The root word is hieros, which means sacred, and archi again means beginning, principle, or source. And archi in o logos, in the beginning was the word. Archi is a very important term, both theologically and philosophically, goes back centuries, millennia. The pre-Socratics, the Milesians, who are regarded as the first among Western philosophers, Thales, they believed in searching for that original principle that underlies reality. What is that permanent principle which underlines reality? So, archi has a very long history. Dionysius bases his teaching on the divine oracles or words, the logia, the theologia, the divine words or oracles. That is, on words of the Old and New Testaments, on the prophets, on the words of Christ, on the words of the apostles, and especially on the words of St. Paul, whose disciple he was. The theology of St. Dionysius is the theology, as we intimated earlier, of St. Maximus the Confessor and of St. Gregory Palamas, two of the greatest fathers in the history of the Church. I want to follow a basic structure in this introduction, which was given by Metropolitan Hierotheos in a lecture that he gave some time ago, in which he said, first of all, it's important to understand that the whole vision of Dionysius is based on theosis, deification. This is evident when you read Dionysius from the perspective of St. Maximus and St. Gregory Palamas. Theosis as the source of deification. The theurgy, the divine principle or beginning to which Dionysius refers in his works. There are 4 treatises, by the way, and 9 letters. We'll come back to that later. But these 4 treatises, relatively short, and 9 letters have played a crucial role in the history of Christian doctrine. So, in his references to theurgy, it becomes evident that what Dionysius is talking about is deification, and indeed theurgia, the divine principle, is the source of our deification. And he also refers to prodos, which is procession, and prodos, procession, which is another key term, regards the whole universe as a kind of theophany. The procession, that the theurgia, the source of our deification, is discerned or seen to make through the universe, is a revelation of God. And the purpose and result of this manifestation is the deification of us human beings, the deification of man, raising us to the likeness of Christ, in whose image we were created. Dionysius also speaks of the divine names, theonymies, names of the divine, ta ονόματα του Θεού, the names of God. God actually has no name according to his essence. But at the same time, he is polyonymous. He has many names. Anonymous, according to his essence. Polyonymous in his processions. And thus has many names according to his energy, his grace, his light, his life, his eros, love, justice, kingdom, wisdom, power, divinity, peace, holiness, and so on. These names, which we human beings have given to God, names which we use to describe the various activities of God's uncreated energies. These are names employed to describe the different operations of the uncreated energy, in the singular, of God himself. In his De Divinis Nominibus, on the divine names. Two names stand out in particular. Dokalon, with one lambda, is the beautiful. The other name is Doagathon. That signifies the good. So we have the beautiful and the good. Dokalon is utilized by Dionysius as a synonym of kalos. This is a paretymology. So you have dokalon, dokalos. This can be good, it can also mean beautiful. At any rate, doagathon is the good, and these terms go back to Plato and before. So they are philosophical terms which Dionysius uses in a theological way. The philosophers spoke of the highest existence as dokalogarathon, with the beautiful and the good, dokalon and doagathon, joined with a ge, the beautiful and the good. Dokalogarathon, one word. So the beautiful and the good. So these are names which are given to God. St. Gregory Palamas talks about this in his disputations with Gregoras. The names that we give to the activities, the energy of God, and the many ways by which God operates in the world, in our lives. These are names which are given to God by us. There are cataphatic names, and there are apophatic names given to God. Apophatic names such as aoratos, invisible, akataliptos, incomprehensible, aperigraptos, indescribable, hypertheos. We'll see this when we read the Mystical Theology. Dionysius loves to use the superlative hyper, hyper, or the Latin equivalent super. So hypertheos, above and beyond theos. What can be above and beyond theos? Dionysius says, whatever you have in your mind, whatever concept you have in your mind when you think of God, the reality of God is above and beyond that concept. God is not an idea in our minds. Hyper-noose, again, above and beyond the noose. God transcends the noose, yes. God transcends every aspect of our limited, created nature, including our noose, which is most godlike. Some fathers identify the noose as the very image of God in us. But the noose in Orthodox patristic tradition is not capable by itself of beholding God, because it is created, and God is uncreated. And therefore, only by the transformation of the noose is it enabled to see God. It is, as we've said before, the eye of the soul. It is, as we've said before, a power of the heart. But even the godlike nous in us is incapable of seeing God unless it is enabled to do so by our loving God. So our God is indeed hyper-nous, which is not the case in philosophy. In the philosophy of Plato and others, the nous is exalted and regarded as divine. In Plato's philosophy, it survives death. It is the only immortal part which survives death in Plato and also in Aristotle and then Middle and Neoplatonists later. At any rate, that's not the case in Orthodox theology. Every part of us is created and limited, created in order to be filled with the life of God, yes. But once we have been transformed or enabled to do so by His grace, in other words, it's a pure gift. We do not have that capacity by nature, because we are not divine by nature. We may become divine, godlike, by grace, which is the purpose for which the Lord has brought us into existence. And so it almost goes without saying to add, looking at names which Dionysius uses, hypernoesis. God is above and beyond thought. Hyperlogiki. God is above and beyond reason. What is the most exalted aspect of man in a post-Augustinian Western theology? It's reason. Although, to be fair to St. Augustine, he understood that we had a noose, and he wasn't quite as rationalistic as those who followed him later. So, hyperlogiki and so forth. The theurgy, the theurgy, is a reflection of the light, capital L. And this reflects the unity of all things with God. To agathon, the good, is the sole cause of all things. Η μοναδική αιτία των πάντων, which manifests the light of God, the energy of God, and Dionysius calls it photodosia, light poured over the whole universe by the theurgy, by the theurgia. Don't worry, we're going to repeat these points in our presentation as it unfolds. So we'll say these things several times from different angles. So, to kalos, beauty, so this is the pattern of the Dionysian vision. God, who is good, sends out His grace, His light, and causes His beauty to shine throughout the universe. And so this beauty is imparted to all beings. When man sees the beauty reflected in all things created by God, he's attracted and inspired by it. He's inspired to return to God. And so the world is a reflection of God's goodness and beauty. Later, God willing, we'll have an opportunity to explain why Dionysius describes these truths in this kind of language, with these particular terms. So the world is a reflection of God's goodness and beauty, and as such, it is also a reflection of the unity of all things in God. Whatever the theurgia creates is a reflection of the light, of the beauty of God. And so we have two movements. I mentioned them in passing earlier. First, with goodness, to agathon, God moves towards creation. And second, with kalos, that is beauty, the whole creation returns through beauty to God. And this is because God is both eros and eraston. Yes, Dionysius deliberately uses the word denoting passionate love. As eros, God moves towards man. And as eraston, that which is loved passionately loved, as eraston, as beauty, God attracts all creation towards himself. Elki tatu erotos vektika. He draws to himself all things that are receptive of his love. They're drawn to his love. So God is both eros and eraston. We could say that as eros, God is good, and we could relate to eraston, that which is loved, with kallos, in the sense that when created beings see the beauty of God in creation, they return to God and glorify him, and are united with him. And these are the two movements of God towards creation, and then of creation towards God. And by these two movements, the unity between God and all creation is seen. So God is both kallos and agathos. He is good and beautiful, and these are theonymias. They are names of God, names ascribed to God by men. But beyond the fact that man gives names to the energies of God, in which man participates, there exists at the same time the apophatic aspect, which is the gnophos, the thick, dark cloud. So beyond that in which the saints do participate, there is something, quote unquote, which cannot be approached. And we call this ousia, essence, the thick, dark cloud, the superabundance of God's brilliance, of the light of God. Gnophos is not the absence of God. The thick, dark cloud does not mean God is not present. It is not the darkness of God. It is the superabundant presence of God, which we experience as darkness because we are unable to see God's superluminosity, and so it's blinding. It blinds us. Now, with hierarchia, the sacred principle, which is developed in two of Dionysius's works, in particular, the celestial hierarchy and the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Dionysius speaks of medochi in the theonymia, participation in the names of God, which means participation in the energies of God. Now, the word hierarchia comes from the root word hieron and archo, the verb archo, which denote the source of holiness. We typically use the term to denote order, the ordering or chain of command, and this meaning also exists in Dionysius. But please note that it is not the primary meaning of hierarchia. When Dionysius speaks of hierarchy, although order and ordering or a chain of command is also implicit, he employs the term, firstly, to refer to the higher ranks of the hierarchy, receiving the outpouring of the hierarch. And then he refers to it as passing this on, transmitting it to the ranks below. And secondly, to the fact that the higher ranks attract the lower ranks by means of the two movements mentioned earlier, that is to say, the lower ranks are attracted by the middle ranks, and the middle ranks are attracted by the higher ranks, and they are all led up to God, to the beauty of God, of the theurgy, the source of deification. So, the source of hierarchy, the source of holiness, always exists, for it is the source of participation in the energy of God. Dionysius says that the archi and ousia of the whole hierarchy is God. And the hierarchy is the theophania, the theophany of the good and the beautiful. The hierarchy is the manifestation of God. These are synonyms, right? The good is God, the beautiful is God. The purpose of hierarchy is, Dionysius says, union with God. Skopos hierarchias estin os effikton aphomios ke enosis. So, as far as it is possible, aphomiosis means it's almost like an absorption, to be absorbed, to enter into this profound communion with God. And enosis. Actually, Dionysius often speaks in terms of enosis, union with God, and he also speaks in terms of perfection in God. God, who is the hierarchy, makes his creatures who behold him divine statues. Thea agalmata. A statue in Greek is an agalma, agalmata being the plural. This is a word that comes from agalome. Agalome means I rejoice. So, I see and I rejoice. When Dionysius says, the hierarchy makes his creatures who behold him divine statues, he's saying that they rejoice in beholding him. So the divine statues become mirrors of divine beauty. And through them is transmitted the uncreated energy of God. And he gives, as an example, that of the sun's rays passing through windows. This is an image that Gregory Palamas uses much later. The thinner, cleaner windows, in other words, allow more sunlight in. These are more refined windows. These are the higher ranks. And the more the light, the more the joy. And they become divine statues, meaning we see them and we rejoice in seeing the divine light in them. So, participation in the original light is commensurate with our receptiveness of the beauty of the hierarch, who is the source of all holiness. And Dionysius says that hierarchy is three things. First, you have order, doxis, that is to say, when God created the world, he gave it a certain order. God is the God of order, not chaos. God is the doxiarchia, the God of order. And that order is related to a certain analogy. Then we have hiera episteme, which means divine science. Episteme is a word that Plato had used, others had used, other philosophers. It simply comes from episteme, which means I know well. Episteme. And hiera episteme, divine knowledge in Dionysius refers to that knowledge which each rank possesses in the hierarchy according to its level of participation in the hierarch, in the one who gives order to the hierarchy. Just as we have a different view of ourselves when we look in a mirror and when we look in a crystal. That's the image that's used. Then we have the iera energia, which is divine energy. The hierarchy draws all creation to itself and makes it theoides, which means like God. Grace. Depending on the effect of grace, it is called variously. Purifying energy, illuminating energy, perfecting energy. So, those are the three levels, so to speak, of hierarchy in Dionysius. Daxi, that order related to a certain analogy, comes from the theurgy. Daxiarchia, we've already said that. Episteme, knowledge of God, comes from the theurgy episteme. And energia is that purifying, illuminating, perfecting grace, which comes from the theurgy energia. Again, energia, to use the Erasmian pronunciation. So, participation in the energies of God, by analogy, is called hierarchy. Let me just say a word about this. It's interesting, it's a spiritual law, speaking of the higher ranks and the lower ranks, and we'll get into this a little bit later. But let me just say at this point, there is this desire when one participates in God. Is there not a desire when we receive the grace of God also to pass on, to transmit the grace of God to others? It's a natural desire. It comes naturally. When we receive something from God, yes, we receive it for ourselves, but not only for ourselves. God's will is for us to share His love, to share His grace, to share what He gives to us, to share them with others. I think that that's important in understanding the Dionysian notion of hierarchy. And, as I said, we'll come back to that point in due course. So, to close this introductory section, participation in the energies of God is what hierarchia in Dionysius is all about. He uses triads to convey a trinity of hypostases on one level, but not of the energy of God, of course. He refers to the angelic powers. It's Dionysius who gives us the 9 ranks of angelic powers. Come back to that point later. One of the reasons why the Dionysian corpus is regarded as being a later body of writings is because he refers to monastics. But in fact, when he does so, he's not referring to them by the usual terms. Monachos, monachikizoi, monk, monastic life in Greek. He doesn't use those terms. He uses the word therapeute, those who are well-pleasing, which actually goes back to an earlier date in the history of the early church. So that's an interesting point as far as the dating of the corpus is concerned. We'll come back to that point as well. Laos, the people. Dionysius regards the Laos of God, the people of God. When he speaks of the people of God, he speaks of a people of God who are in a state of illumination. This is quite shocking in some ways compared to the situation that we have today. It's rather challenging, to say the least. The Laos, the people of God, often they know very little. Thank God they come to church. And were it not for certain notable exceptions among our clergy and our hierarchy, our people are almost uncatechized. They're almost at the level of catechumens at best. So references to the people of God in Dionysius is quite striking. Not a small detail, because he regards the Laos as being in a state of illumination and as progressing towards deification, perfection. It's a very challenging picture of the life of the church that he presents. He also refers to imperfect members of the church, those who are undergoing purification. Hierotheos, he refers to the sacred mysteries, the sacraments, baptism, chrismation, miron, and the Eucharist, of course. He refers to the Incarnation. Christ revealed the goodness and beauty of God to attract men to himself on every level, including the physical. So even physically, he fills creation with himself. He fills us with himself physically by means of the physical divine Eucharist. And all of this reveals to us the thea thelimata, the divine wills. Wills in the plural. It's interesting. The divine wills. Οι λόγοι των όντων, η ενέργεια του Θεού. The pre-existent principles of all beings. The energy of God. One final note. So there is the world which comes after the fall and which does not participate in God's divine wills. The energies of God, the logoi of all things. Ο εκτός της ιεραρχίας κόσμος, ο κόσμος μετά την πτώση. By reading the Mystical Theology, we're going to come, I believe, to a deeper understanding of Dionysius' theological vision. So I make no bones about it. What I am attempting to do is to present Dionysius as he has come down to us through Maximus and Palamas, as I mentioned earlier. So there are questions, and of course that's understandable, given the language that Dionysius employs. Very philosophical. And, of course, in the West, this is how he's understood. He's read and he's analyzed and regarded as a Platonist, Neoplatonist, a philosophizing theologian, a philosopher in Christian guise. In fact, I remember when I was reading Dionysius for my doctoral studies at Oxford, I was looking to find respected scholarship that did not present Dionysius in this sort of philosophical tradition, which is common in the West. And it was very difficult. Apart from Lossky, who had written, of course, the Mystical Theology, deliberately so titled, and before he had written his Mystical Theology, he had written two significant articles on Dionysius. One was on Dionysius' use of analogy, and I was stunned by, well, Lossky was a big enough name not to be ignored entirely by Western scholarship, but he was almost entirely ignored. And when he was mentioned in this or that book or article on Dionysius, he was dismissed. Probably the person who took him most seriously was Polycarp Sherwood, who actually specialized in Maximus the Confessor and gives Lossky some credit in raising certain questions. Yeah, long story short, the air that we breathe in the West, just as we have an Augustinian oxygen that we breathe, also carries with it this understanding, this approach to Dionysius. But you see, in the Orthodox tradition, irrespective of the provenance of the corpus itself and the identification of the authorship, irrespective of that, the Dionysian writings are regarded as the product of a man of prayer and a man of the liturgical tradition of the Church. This I find a refreshing and encouraging approach. Now, the question of why he uses this kind of language, let me just say in passing, let's assume that Dionysius is a disciple of St. Paul. Where did St. Paul convert him? On Mars Hill. The place was full of Epicureans and Stoics, and these were philosophers listening to St. Paul, who couldn't bear it when St. Paul started to speak of the resurrection, the physical resurrection of the body. And one of them was Dionysius, and others with him. So the question is, who is Dionysius writing for? Because when you're writing for a particular group of persons, you want to speak a language which they will understand. So you will use terms, concepts, phraseology that is familiar to them in order to convey what you want to convey. The question is, what is the substance? What is the meaning of your use of their terms? So I think that this is what we're going to attempt to uncover as we go along. When we say mystical theology, we don't mean some exotic form of theology that's fine if you like that kind of thing. Mystical theology means that theology which is an initiation into the mysteries of God. And this is why such great fathers as Maximus, very well versed in philosophy, takes Dionysius very seriously. And one of the things that we're going to discover along the way is the use of the term apophatic. It's based on experience, that knowledge of God which is born of experience. And the problem is that in the West, there is nothing beyond reason now. There was something beyond reason with Augustine. I keep saying, to be fair to St. Augustine, because he at least was aware of the noose, the noetic aspect of man. But certainly after Descartes and the Enlightenment, you have this now fixation on reason, and there is nothing beyond reason. So that when we say apophatic, there are two ways by which we can understand apophatic. The first is almost taking it literally as a kind of jeu de mots, playing on words, where you just quite easily say what something is not. In this case, God. God is not this, God is not that. We can all play that game. And I guess philosophers can play that game on a more sophisticated level, but it's the same game. Then there's that apophaticism to which Dionysius refers, which is the product of genuine living experience of God, which leads one to say that, for example, yes, we say that God is light, but when we say that God is light, the light of God is not what we mean when we refer to other forms of light. The light of the sun, the light produced by fire, electric light we have today, and so on and so forth. This light is other. This light goes beyond. And it's beyond our understanding. It's beyond our experience of the created order. That's why it's apophatic. So, these two ways of using the term apophatic, and the apophaticism of Dionysius is certainly on that experiential level. Now, in the West, understandably, there has been a kind of suspicion that has grown up with people who claim to have experiences. But these experiences and the suspicions that go with them, sometimes justifiably so, they belong to another culture and to another tradition. That is not what we mean when we speak of experience of God, and so on and so forth. So yeah, more to be unpacked, certainly, in due course. Please subscribe to our channel and share with your friends. Click on the notification bell and on the join button below our video and become a friend or reader of the Mount Tabor Academy. Support our drive to introduce the theology and spiritual life of the Orthodox Church to the wider community. Click on the Support the Show button in the description box and become a supporter of the Mount Tabor Academy podcasts, which aim to introduce the theology and spiritual life of the Orthodox Church to the wider community.